Hello and welcome to my YouTube video. This is a draw along or a drawing tutorial, I guess, of the sketch that you'd see in the thumbnail. So I like to begin my drawings by toning the paper. I think that it's a lot less nerve-wracking starting on toned paper and trying to fix the chaos that's on the paper rather than starting with a perfectly white sheet and trying to create something out of it. Can be quite daunting. So I like to start by toning the paper. I simply use sandpaper, and I take compressed charcoal or willow charcoal, and I sand it down on the sandpaper, and I just rub it onto the sheet. It's not the best use of no, not the best way to get the desired effect that I'm looking for, because the sandpaper's texture is quite gritty and it's rough, and I tend to damage the paper. But it's what I have for now, and I'll be looking at upgrading that supply or looking to get something to fix that problem at some point. So I like to take this dirty blending stump, and as you can see, it's quite dirty, and that's mainly from trying to blend in my extra soft charcoal. So I can get a quick idea and placement of the figure and place shadows. This is a very important step. Essentially, every movement or every mark is a lot more calculated than it looks. There are times when I use the dirty blending stump to just get soft abstraction and get some tone and marks on the paper, especially in the periphery. But when I'm doing these gestured, deeper brush strokes in the middle of the paper, I'm generally laying down the basic composition of the piece, and it might not look like much at first, but if you see the final product, you'll see that a lot of the work is actually being done compositionally with the dirty blending stump. So it takes quite a while to do, and that's why I use the largest blending stump that I have. It's rubbing compressed charcoal into the paper, so it's not the easiest to remove. I mean, charcoal is a very forgiving medium and it's quite easy to remove charcoal, but compared to the wallowed charcoal that I turned into the paper, this is a bit more permanent. So it's important to get those shapes. I like to sign my drawings in the beginning. I tend to feel that the drawing is yours whether it comes up well or not, and it just motivates you to put something extra in to make sure that it's really a good piece by signing it at the beginning. Sometimes I forget to do that, but when I do, I always sign my paper or canvas at the start. So yeah, I'm coming in with a soft woodless charcoal pencil. It's actually quite great for getting smaller marks, and I can get a bit more specific and exact. So this is where I'm fleshing out a bit more detail in the shapes. I'm not working on details per se, but I am being a bit more exact about the shapes and getting the darker parts of the shadows a bit darker. I also use this to get an outline. So I generally like to start by outlining the shape of the figure, and it sets me at ease that if I have the right shape, you can generally work out from the landmarks of the silhouette where things go. I find it easier to work that way than to have a face and then outline everything afterwards. So this step is also quite calculated with where I'm putting the shapes, because this is, I compare a woodless charcoal pencil to compressed charcoal. It's also quite difficult to get out, and because this is a soft charcoal pencil, the marks that I'm making are actually quite dark. It's on the darker side of the values that I have to work with. I will come in and blend this out and erase things, but I like working with the dark or the soft charcoal pencil because the tone of the um, hard charcoal pencil is a bit too cool, and I don't like how hard I have to press to get the value that I want with the dark pencil, and I end up ruining the texture of the paper and coming back in with soft charcoal over dark charcoal. It's not as nice as if I organically went in with soft charcoal at the start. So this shadow is actually quite a complex shadow. It falls onto the chest and it shapes the chest. So this is an area of the drawing that's in the periphery. It's not going to be the main subject, but I've spent quite a bit of time on it because I'm not going to come back and spend a lot more time on it later on. So it's nice to start with that element. And also because it's not the main part of the drawing, it's very much a low stakes aspect. So I like to start with that and sort of warm my way into the more important pieces of the drawing. And as you can see here, I'm starting to outline the head. And the head is where I want the eye to be drawn. So I'm going to spend a lot of time doing a lot of detailed work. And I also want the area around the head to be very dark so that the contrast really pulls the eye to that area of the drawing. I'm being very specific about the shapes and the silhouette of that face. I think that's the one of the key features of this drawing. The face being negatively drawn by the shadow behind it. And this is a make or break part of the drawing. If I can get that silhouette down properly, it would add a lot to the drawing. And any mistake here would be very noticeable. So I start lightly compared to the marks that I can possibly get on my with my soft charcoal pencil. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to darken that area up quite significantly. I think I messed up a bit with the placement of the shadow on that hand, but it's not a major blow. I can lighten that area up at some point. Hopefully the shape of the figure is coming to light. I like to grip the pencil at the base. It gives me a much more organic and loose, sketchy mark. But when I come in with details, I tend to hold the pencil like a normal pencil, like I'm writing. It gives me a lot more control. Sometimes I get engrossed in what I'm doing and I don't change basic things of technique that I should be doing. So this area of the face is where there's a lot of detail, and yeah, there I change my grip to have a bit more control. The thing that I like about this drawing is that there's not a lot of elements on the face and a very few detailed marks gives a goes a long way to rendering the face. So a few well placed shadows and shapes would pull the viewer to interpreting the face as a face. I mean, that's a pretty decent rendering of the eye and the nose as it is. Just putting in that shadow of the mouth. It's important to draw what you are actually seeing in the reference. Don't get stuck into drawing a mouth from memory because it's not going to look right. Your some of your features resembling the reference and some from memory is going to possibly result in a rendering of a face that looks like a face, but it's not going to look significantly like your reference. And I'm definitely not an advocate that you should try and get an exact rendering of your reference. There are photos for that. I like doing more impressionistic work, and I like highlighting and emphasizing certain elements of a drawing or a face. But if you want your drawing to look like the reference, it's important to draw what you are seeing. Place the highlights where they are, even though they may look funny in isolation. When you zoom out and you look at the bigger picture, it's going to result in a much more accurate piece of work. So, touching up some details in the face. Hair is very tricky, and I think people spend a lot of time drawing each individual strand of hair. I treat the hair as I treat any other element of the drawing. I start with larger shapes, larger shadows, and then I slowly work my way down to individual locks of hair. In a larger piece, I might even get into drawing individual strands of hair, and those few strands would go a long way into rendering the locks to resemble locks. But in a piece this small, I think it's not really realistic to draw individual strands of hair. It's also very difficult on rough paper to get that much detail in. There are some advantages to using rough paper. A lot of the texture is built into the paper, so the face um, and the skin has a lot of texture just from placing the charcoal onto the paper that I wouldn't have to draw organically. So I tend to use the rough paper for older faces with a lot of texture. But the disadvantage is that details like individual strands of hair is not going to come across as well. I had a really hard time drawing in this hand. The hand and the shapes didn't fully make sense to me, but I just drew what I saw, and I think it's not the most detailed hand, but the eye reads it relatively well as I could get it to have read as a hand in that position. You have to let the composition and the context stand for itself. If I drew the hand 100% perfectly and the nipple on his chest 100% perfectly, it would be very distracting and it would just look like a realistic drawing. But there's something about rendering an element of your drawing with detail and keeping the rest loose that goes a long way with regards to the interpretation of your artwork. So I'm pretty happy with the silhouette that I have, and I'm coming in a bit harder to darken those areas. I should probably be using a bigger piece of charcoal. My pencil has seen some days. It's almost down to the end. So here I'm just making abstract marks, keeping it loose. Um, Makes the drawing a lot more interesting than a simple rendering in the middle and then strange shapes and blank outskirts of the paper. I really like using the blending stump for this reason or for this purpose, because I can come back very easily with the kneaded eraser and remove those marks, as opposed to adding tone to the paper with a different tool. I'm sort of just smudging the charcoal that is already there, which makes it easier to come back and remove what has been smudged rather than coming in and pressing a tool into the paper and adding thick layers of compressed charcoal. I guess you could also use a piece of willow charcoal and just rub it in with your hand. There's a lot of versatility, and I think a good artist should be able to use whatever tool he has in his hand to get the mark. With different levels of difficulty, I think drawing a whole artwork with one tool takes a considerable amount of skill, and it would go a long way to improving your skill set if you practice in that way. It's not entirely necessary all the time. You don't need all the tools to be able to make a good artwork, but it is nice to have those extra specific tools at your disposal, and we all have our preferences. So, just as adding shadows is important to rendering the face, a few well placed highlights is equally as important. The thing that I like about charcoal drawing is that it's very akin to sculpting, to painting, to drawing as an art medium, and I don't think anything else compares to it. In the beginning, it very much felt like a painting with the blending stump and gesturing the lights and the darks. It's the same process I would use if I was to paint a portrait in oils. And drawing the details with a pencil is very akin to drawing, and coming in with a kneaded eraser and carving out highlights, I find very akin to sculpting. I think it's a medium that offers a lot of value for people looking to improve their skill set. Makes one become a much more versatile artist. Again, trying to just keep it loose on the body. There's not a lot of subtlety in what I'm doing in the body, a lot of black and white, and not a lot of mid-tone. On the left hand side of the body, I'm sort of hinting and gesturing towards mid-tones, collarbones, other features on the body, but not too detailed, very obscure. The thing that I love about artwork is letting the viewer interpret elements of the drawing, and for some or other reason, I feel that the brain appreciates being part of the process of interpreting the picture. An element that is hinted at that the brain sort of has to interpret as a neck muscle or collarbone is going to come across as a lot more nuanced and I guess the word is escaping me that I want to use. But you know what I mean. Making your viewer's brain work makes them feel as though they are part of the drawing. They constructed that neck muscle in their mind. Whether consciously or subconsciously, it's going to add to the interpretation of the drawing. So I think we have a lot of key features. We have a lot of the face mapped out. I think it's time to come in with the extra soft charcoal and darken some of those shadows. And this process is actually a lot more satisfying than one would think, making those shadows pop again. We've come in with a blending stump, we've come in with a eraser, we've smudged the darks. Um, Adding highlights will definitely go towards making those darks pop, but all of the other work we've done took away from that dark element of the drawing. So it's very satisfying to come back in with the extra soft charcoal and pop those shadows back in. It's important not to overdo it at this stage. If you try and erase the extra soft charcoal, you end up smudging a lot of it, and it can darken your piece or your paper very quickly. I really do like extra soft charcoal though. I think it's one of my favorite pieces of charcoal to use. And I think if I had to choose a single piece of charcoal to do a drawing, it would probably be an extra soft piece of charcoal. I tend to press very lightly, so even in my planning sketches or just generally in life, whenever I use a pencil, I have to use a softer lead to get the same amount of mark as an average person would. So I think the extra soft charcoal is sort of familiar to me in that aspect, and it allows me to compensate for the light hand that I have when it comes to applying a medium or a material onto the canvas or paper. Sure, as you've noticed by now, I'm drawing this piece outdoors. It was a nice day. This is not my normal setup for my drawings. I found it quite difficult. There was a bit of a wind, and because I'm outdoors, my toolbox of art materials was far, so I had to keep on going back and forth to get some of those things. Darkening the shadow behind the figure adds a lot to bringing the figure out into the drawing. When it's a lot of mid-tone on the paper, not a lot stands out. So I especially want the face to pop. So having the extra soft charcoal to darken that shadow, especially around the face, I think really goes a long way to making the figure pop. And I haven't rubbed this charcoal in, that would darken it because there's a lot of grit. I'm using rough paper. So rubbing the extra soft charcoal into that grit is going to take out a lot of that white specks and texture around the in the shadow. So yeah, I'm coming in with the medium pencil, a medium softness pencil. I'm using this one not because it's lighter specifically, but because the tip was a lot sharper than I could get the soft pencil to to come to come to. So I was able to get a lot more detail in the shapes of the features of the face than I would have had if I stayed with a soft pencil. I don't like to take too long with my drawings. I've been trying to force myself to take longer than I usually do. I do want to get more detailed with my portraits, and I think I draw too quickly to be able to get the level of detail that I'm looking for. I simply don't have the patience to draw in a lot of the detail that I want. It does help that I focus on one area of the drawing and I try and add as much detail as I can in that element alone, and I keep the rest pretty vague and loose. I think a lot of the shadow and light on the areas of the face that isn't covered by hair are pretty much rendered as well as I'm going to get them on this rough paper. So a lot of the remaining work to be done is going to be in the beard. And here, as you can see, I'm adding dark areas, light areas, and as you go along, the figure will become more and more detailed, and you should just stop when you feel comfortable. You can see I'm looking a lot at my reference. It's easy to draw here and think you're drawing from memory, and 1 second you are consciously adding nice curly locks, and the next thing you're just jabbing with the pencil in straight lines and throwing individual hairs. So I have to make a conscious effort to look at my reference and make sure that I'm drawing what I'm seeing. There are elements of the drawing that are a lot easier to get trapped into drawing from memory, and I think there is probably an element of any portrait that's going to trap artists the most. I've been trapped many times by hair. It's nice to come back to more vague and loose elements of the drawing before you go back in and do the detail, switching it up back and forth. The detailed parts of the drawing can become very tiring very quickly for me, so I like to every now and again switch it back up. The last thing you want to be doing is finding the drawing that you're doing tedious and an effort. You want to enjoy the process. So do it in a way that is enjoyable for you. I was very intrigued by the composition of this drawing. The thoughtful gaze of the figure, particularly that hand. I didn't do that justice, in my opinion, but I think it adds towards making the face the focal point of the drawing. I would have liked, particularly if the hand at least, not necessarily the arm, but the hand was a bit better rendered. I think I do come back in and add a bit more detail and shading to it, but I wasn't quite sure whether to add this element of the drawing or not. I thought that there was quite a nice shadow in that space, and if I messed it up, I could always just cover it up again and um, hide that aspect of the drawing. I do that quite often. If there are weaker areas of the drawing, I throw in a lot of compressed charcoal and I make it part of the abstraction or the abstract elements of the drawing. I think this hand is a bit weak, but I don't think it's necessarily weaker than the other hand. So I opted to keep it in as an element. I came in with the blending stamp, or I just rubbed in the charcoal around that area to um, make it less detailed, and it's very easy to do that. You can partially render an element of your drawing and just rub the charcoal out, and it would look very natural as an area of whatever scene the mind is looking at that's in low light. You're not going to see a lot of detail anyway, so it actually looks a lot more accurate if you are drawing a part of the drawing that the eye is not supposed to focus on. If you do it loosely rather than very accurately and with a lot of detail. Just cleaning up some shadow, adding some subtle shading. And this is where I start to rub in that soft charcoal that I was talking about earlier. Rubbing the extra charcoal sitting on the paper into the grit takes out a lot of the white in that shadow and makes the shadow appear a lot more darker, and it's going to bring the figure out more. Oftentimes I carve out light and I come in with a blending stump and I smudge it all up again and carve out light again and smudge it again. And it adds an element of depth to the drawing that I wouldn't get in one try. It's sort of like an aggregate of you carving out the lights in the key areas, and maybe you render one aspect really well, and when you smudge it out, you don't smudge it out completely. There's still an aspect of that area that you carved out really well that would shine through on the next rendering. And over time, it averages out to a more accurate fleshing out of the light. At least that's what I've found in my amateur experience. You can see that I haven't come back in the body of the figure a lot after I did it in the beginning. And that's why I did spend a bit of time on it, but the majority of the time I spent on this drawing was in the face, and it's an important thing to keep in mind. How you allot your time. You should think of time as a resource, and the more time you spend in one element of your drawing, the more, not necessarily better, you can certainly overwork a piece, but the more accurate your rendering is going to be. So if you intend to not render an element of your drawing accurately, you should reflect that in the amount of time you spend drawing that piece or that element of your drawing. There are aspects to a drawing that you're going to do that no one is going to notice consciously, but the mind does read a lot of subconscious features of a drawing. And I feel like this is probably one of the biggest examples of something that I do that isn't consciously read. A lot of the abstraction or wild gestures that I make on the outside, I just let them naturally flow. And some of the lines I really like, and I try to carve them out a bit, make them stand out. The kneaded eraser is a very underrated tool, and I think it's probably equally important, if not possibly more important, than the charcoal that you're using when you're making a drawing. I think the well executed use of a kneaded eraser can certainly overcome a poorer use of the charcoal. I don't think I'm particularly that good with the charcoal in hand, but I think I'm a bit better with the kneaded eraser. I'm just cleaning up some of the peripheral elements of the drawing. I tend to, at the end, have a lot of smudges and marks that I don't necessarily need. It's always good to check your reference at the end of the drawing and see if there are any areas that you want to improve on, fix that you didn't quite get right. This should generally be a small or minor detail, but it's good to do those final checks. So yeah, I'm coming in with the Tombow um, mono eraser. Very good eraser for detailed work. It's a bit harder, so I'm able to get a lot more charcoal out of the paper with this eraser compared to the kneaded eraser, but it's not quite good for erasing large pieces or large areas. So yeah, I'm coming in and refining a lot of the shadow and details that I couldn't get with the kneaded eraser in the face. And I think it's good enough to just render the locks of hair, and it would give an adequate impression of detail for this piece. I like to do my drawings in a style similar to how I would do an oil painting, where you generally just block in the shadow and light areas, and as you carry on with the painting, you block in smaller and smaller shapes, and the piece would end up looking better as you go along. And I think it's a lot easier to do with charcoal because you are just working with black, white, and grays instead of mixing a lot of pigment and color, and you have to be wary of the color theory and not um, muddy up your colors, and there's a lot of turpentine and linseed oil involved and so on. So I find charcoal a lot easier to work with in that regard. It is tricky with the smudging and macing, but got a cheap set of black gloves and it seems to fix the problem. I think paper is also a lot cheaper than canvas, so and charcoal as a medium is actually very, very inexpensive in total. I mean, a kneaded eraser is a lot cheaper than the job that it would do in your piece. You can get one piece of compressed charcoal, one piece of willow charcoal, and one pencil, and that should be fun enough to create artworks. You don't need a whole set of each individual item. So we are coming to the end of this drawing, and I'm pretty happy with the outcome. I think that the key areas of the drawing that I wanted to focus on were really well rendered. The parts that were abstract remained abstract. There's a nice message, the thoughtful gaze of the figure. Hope you enjoyed that one. Thanks. Bye.